Hello, class. Professor Vanderbilt back. This is lecture 15 for History 102. At the end of the last lecture, we were talking about Woodrow Wilson and the triple wall of privilege. Now we need to cover the third wall, which are trusts. So, trusts and monopolies are going to be the theme of Woodrow Wilson's State of the Union address in 1914. And he is going to ask Congress to pass legislation which goes well beyond the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that Theodore Roosevelt and President Taft used to bust apart trusts and monopolies in America. So Congress will respond, and in 1914, they're going to pass the Clayton Antitrust Act. Now, this is going to go much further than the Sherman Antitrust Act, give the Justice Department more power to go after trusts and monopolies. It'll also allow them to go after price discrimination, the practice of interlocking directorates that we talked about much earlier in class, and it will be highly utilized by the Justice Department to pick up where Roosevelt and Taft had left off. But to my mind, the most important aspect of the Clayton Antitrust Act is that it, for the first time, legitimized labor unions. It outlawed the practice of going to a court to get a court injunction to stop a strike, which is the justification that President Hayes used during the Great Railroad Strike and had been used by other presidents. And it allowed unions to legitimately remain on strike as long as they did not destroy any property or become violent. As long as they peacefully picketed, the strike could go on indefinitely. And a judge couldn't stop it, and obviously neither could the United States military. So this was a big move forward for the average person and labor unions in America. Now, the next thing we want to talk about here with President Wilson, there's some other progressive reforms that are going to be ushered in under his presidency. There's going to be the first ever Workmen's Compensation Act passed, sort of following the footsteps of the Wisconsin idea. This will happen in 1916, and it'll apply to all civil service employees of the federal government. There'll be child labor laws passed to start limiting when a child could work in a factory, because remember, in the past, there were no limits whatsoever. Remember little Andrew Carnegie going to work at age 12. It was perfectly legal. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, these child labor laws will be struck down by the United States Supreme Court, but at least they'll be in effect for a while, and obviously today we have very restrictive child labor laws. And then there was the Adamson Act passed in 1916, which created, for the first time ever, the 8-hour workday. And this applied first to railroad employees, but then was applied to a lot of different employees throughout the country. And it created the 8-hour workday. And if you worked more than 8 hours in a day, then you got something that was completely unknown at the time, overtime pay. Now, an area where Woodrow Wilson fell desperately behind, and there's a lot of controversy about the reasons why this took place, a lot of interpretations, was in the area of civil rights. Now remember, the NAACP and Urban League were up and running. W.E.B. Du Bois and other progressives were out fighting for equality. And in 1912, Woodrow Wilson sought and successfully got the endorsement of all these civil rights groups. So after the election, the leadership of the NAACP and Urban League asked for a meeting in the White House with the president. And at that meeting, they asked him to create a national race commission. Now, what they wanted this National Race Commission to do was study the underlying problems of racism in America and come up with some solutions for these problems that were plaguing us, the lynching, the mob violence, and so forth, so that we talked about, which led to the formation of the Niagara Movement. So Woodrow Wilson said, I'll take this to my cabinet. We'll talk about it. I'll get back to you. Now, he was told by his some of his cabinet members and his political team that he obviously could not do that because they reminded him, you are a minority president. You only won 42% of the vote. You have to build support, not lose support. And if we go back and look at that map on page 672, the gray states are all the states that Woodrow Wilson carried and where his support was. His main support was in the deep South. Now, if he formed a race commission, obviously they're going to point their finger at white Southerners as the main culprits of these problems, especially white Southern politicians with their institutionalized racism and so forth. You can't point the finger at the main body of his support. So they told him, you can't do this right now. You'll lose in 1916 for sure if you do it. Now, some historians argue that Woodrow Wilson was nothing but a racist because he did order the segregation of the federal workforce, where he separated the races in federal buildings, where one floor would be for black employees, one for white, and so forth. Some point to his Southern background. For some time, his father was a minister in Columbia, South Carolina. Then his father and family, he grew up in Virginia. And they point to maybe his childhood and upbringing being plagued with racism. But on the other hand, there's one thing that Woodrow Wilson did that no one can point to him saying he was a racist in this particular move of his. In 1916, an opening came up on the United States Supreme Court. And Woodrow Wilson will appoint to that open position his top advisor and the brainchild of the Triple Wall of Privilege, Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis will be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice in 1916, and he'll serve well into the 1950s. He was a young man when he was appointed. What makes this significant, first of all, is Louis Brandeis is the first Jew ever appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And one thing you need to realize is anti-Semitism was running rampant, not only in Europe, but in the United States during this time period. And there were a lot of critics of this move by Wilson, by anti-Semitic people. Then, once Brandeis is on the court, he will be one of the greatest champions for black civil rights. He will be the person that leads the charge in the 40s and 50s and writes some of the landmark decision opinions that will ultimately lead to Brown versus the Board of Education. Brandeis will do more for African American civil rights than any other Supreme Court justice. and he was appointed to that position all the way back in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson. So I guess it's a redeeming factor for Wilson. Now we want to move to the area of foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State during his first term was an old buddy of ours, three-time loser, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan never successfully became president, but he'll be a fine Secretary of State because certainly he's a great spokesman, speaker, and so forth. Woodrow Wilson will try to implement a more level foreign policy, treating especially our neighbors in Latin America more as equals than the preventative intervention and the dollar diplomacy of his predecessors. In 1916, he'll push for the passage of the Jones Act, which will set the Philippines on a course towards freedom and independence. But unfortunately, that won't materialize for 30 years when they become independent in 1946 due to some unforeseen events such as World War II, when we didn't even control the Philippines, when the Japanese captured it, and also the Great Depression, which obviously isn't a good time for a nation to be granted independence. But what's going to really dominate the foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson, especially in his first term and obviously his second term, are going to be two things. One is the trouble that takes place in Mexico. To sum this up quickly, there's going to be a series of overthrows and revolts in Mexico after a long-term president had held the office who was a great ally of the United States. President Diaz had been in office 37 years and was overthrown in 1911. Then we're going to go through several different leaders. Mexico is going to become very unstable until finally a gentleman by the name of Carranza will become president of Mexico. But in this process, a person will feel betrayed by the United States and Carranza, a person that helped Carranza achieve his position and had been an ally of the United States. That's the famous Pancho Villa. Now, there's a photograph of Pancho Villa on page 680 of your book. There he is with his ragtag army in Mexico in 1916. Pancho Villa will be overlooked for a cabinet position by President Carranza, even though he was responsible for rallying all the peasant support for him and had also been an ally of the United States. And Pancho Villa is very angry about this and blames the United States. So unfortunately, he's going to take the law into his own hands. And at this point in history, the United States has over $1 billion invested in Mexico, and there are 50,000 U.S. citizens living down there, basically engaged in business practices. In January of 1916, Pancho Villa is going to stop a train that's traveling through Mexico, and he knows there are Americans on board. He and his rebels are going to remove 17 Americans from that train, and they're going to murder them in cold blood. And this will become, obviously, a highly publicized event, and Villa shows no remorse for this action. Then he's really going to do something that's even more unacceptable than this, what we would call a terrorist attack in January. In March, he's going to invade New Mexico. He's going to cross the border, attack the small, sleepy town of Columbus, New Mexico, and in this attack, 16 more Americans will die. But this really crosses the line because he's actually invaded the United States. So Woodrow Wilson will have to take action. He will put together an invasionary force to enter into Mexico to hunt down and supposedly capture Pancho Villa and his rebels. The general that'll be put in charge of this invasionary force is General John Blackjack Pershing. Now, a large number of these troops that'll go on this invasion of Mexico will be right from the North Country. There was an army base where the old Air Force bases, the U.S. Oval, that was an army base back at this point in history. And a lot of the troops that Pershing commanded had been stationed right here in Plattsburgh. Now they're going to chase Pancho Villa and his rebels all across the Mexican countryside unsuccessfully because Pancho Villa knew where he was going. He was a champion of the peasants. They hit him, gave him information. But it was a pretty interesting invasion because the United States for the first time was using aircraft for reconnaissance. They had motorized troop transport vehicles, but at the same time they had horse-drawn wagons carrying around supplies. So you could really, when you see old footage of this, and there's a great PBS American experience called The Hunt for Pancho Villa, if you probably look it up on YouTube or something, it kind of shows this transition of the United States military, which will become very important because what's on the doorstep here for America is World War I. So now we want to turn our attention to World War I. World War I had broke out 2 years before Pancho Villa's stunts in 1916. And most of you know from probably studying European history, it all happened when the Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian patriot. Now, what this did was completely upend the foreign policy theory that was dominating the globe at this time, the so-called balance of power theory. The idea was if you had two competing entities in the world, and in this case, it's going to be the Central Powers, who we'll talk about in a second, and the Allies, and if they were evenly matched in these two alliances, that there would never be a war because it would be fruitless. No one could win because the two alliances were basically equal in strength. So war would be fruitless, so there never would be one. Well, unfortunately, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, who most people in the world had never heard of before he was assassinated, will end up triggering this war because one nation in one alliance will declare war on another, and then they're obligated to do the same. And before you know it, the two major alliances, the Central Powers and the Allies, are at war. Now, immediately, though, the United States declares neutrality in this war. We had really been a neutral power ever since George Washington had instructed us to do so in his famous farewell address of 1796. So, to no one's surprise, we're neutral. The Central Powers are, and if you take a look in your book on page 681, we have table 29.1, the principal foreign elements in the United States, but it also shows us who the powers are. The Central Powers are made up of Germany, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, which Archduke Ferdinand was part of. He was the heir to the throne. And then one that they don't show you on this chart is the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey in the majority of the Middle East. On the other side, we had the Allies, which were France, Great Britain, Russia, and Italy were the major players. These were the two warring parties. Now, we were neutral in this war, but as we'll find out very quickly here, neutral my foot. We were supporting one side, the Allies. And we'll see another chart here momentarily to prove this. But we supported the Allies because we had the most in common with them, and they, in origin and so forth, because of our ties to Great Britain and France. Also, Italy being one, and there are a tremendous number of Italian immigrants here. But when it all boiled down to it, and if you look at this chart on 681, according to the census data in 1910, where they ask you questions of where you were born, where your parents were born, and so forth, you can see on this chart, there were 8.2 million people with ties to Germany who will ultimately become our enemy and who we're sort of treating as an enemy, even though we're neutral. There are 2.7 million people with ties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They don't list the Ottoman Empire because there wasn't a significant number of Americans at that point with ties to the Ottoman Empire. Now, as far as ties to the Allies, you can see that there are 3.2 million people with direct ties to Great Britain. We'll skip Ireland momentarily. Russia, there's 2.7 million. Italy, 2 million. Ireland's the wild card, the largest, with 4.5 million people with ties to Ireland. The Irish, as we know from past discussions in this class, hate the British for long, it's the legacy of the relations between Ireland and Britain, dating back to when they were colonized by the British by Sir Humphrey Gilbert. So, the Irish, if you polled them and asked them, who should the United States back in World War I, they'd say, who's fighting the British? Whoever it is, that's who we should support. So you can take that 4.5 million, put them up into the Central Power backers. So when you do it in those terms, there's approximately 15.5 million people, if they had their way in America, would have wanted to back the Central Powers. There's about 8 million people who would have wanted to back the Allies. Obviously, we're not going to back somebody in World War I based on polls. At least, certainly we shouldn't do that in any war. Now, to see what really happens here, turn the page to 682. Look at table 29.2, U.S. exports to belligerents from 1914 to 1916. Belligerents are nations at war in World War I. Remember, we're not in it. We're neutral. We're not going to enter this war until well into 1917, as we'll find out. When you take a look at this, in 1914, before the war really sets in, we've got about $600 million worth of trade with Great Britain, 160 with France, 75 million with Italy, 345 million with Germany. After we really basically take sides economically in this war, look at the figures by 1916. Trade will essentially almost triple with Great Britain. Trade with France will almost quadruple. It will more than triple with the Italians, and will go from approximately $345 million worth of trade with Germany down to $288,000. We cut the Central Powers off from trade and drastically expand trade with the Allies. We took sides in this war long before we entered it by helping one side over the other. Now, the one final thing I want to cover today is something that almost causes the United States to enter this war in 1915. And that's the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Germans' most effective weapon in World War I, there's a photograph of it on the facing page 683. That's the submarine, or the U-boat, as they called them. They were way ahead of everybody in submarine technology, and it was their most effective weapon. Now, what's going to happen in 1915, Germany and the Central Powers have been basically saying to the United States, we know you're supplying our enemies. You either got to supply us equally, or we're going to start sinking your supply ships. And we also suspect you're hiding military supplies on civilian passenger vessels. And if we find out you are, we'll sink those also. So, if you take a look on 683, there's two newspaper clippings. They didn't appear in the newspaper like this one under the other. They were in different pages. One is advertising travel on the Lusitania between the United States and Europe. It's part of the Cunard line of ships. That's the same company that owned the Titanic that most of you are familiar with. Giant passenger ships. Underneath it is a notice put in the newspaper by the Imperial German Embassy, basically telling people, especially Americans, travel at your own risk. We find out there's ammunition on a boat like the Lusitania, we're going to torpedo it and sink it. We've warned the Americans and the Brits. We think they're hiding ammunition on passenger ships and using you as human shields. So, as you can see on the previous page, map 29.2, the Lusitania is located off the shore of the United Kingdom on May 7th, 1915, and it is torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat on May 7th. On board that ship were 128 Americans out of the almost 1,200 people that died that day. This is a horrible event. And immediately, a lot of Americans start calling for us to drop everything. Enough's enough. Enter World War I on the side of the Allies. The Germans have crossed the line. Now, what is discovered here and is produced by the Germans is what was on board that ship. Just as they had claimed, if you look at the ship's lay list, there were 4,200 cases of small arms ammunition down in the hull of that ship. The Germans were correct in their claims. They were hiding military supplies on civilian passenger ships. And that is the reason why the Germans said they sunk it. And basically they say, as you can see by that newspaper ad that they took out, we warned you. So it's going to be everything Woodrow Wilson can do for the next couple years to stop us from entering this war, which he really wants no part of in 1915 or 1916. So that's where we'll call it quits for today. The next time we pick up, we're going to pick up with how World War II keeps materializing here and the election of 1916. So you take care. Have a good rest of the weekend here. And I hope you all have a good Easter tomorrow, even though I know it's not what you're normally used to. Make the best of it. And remember, be safe and stay home. Take care. I'll see you on Monday. Bye now.